Okay, so in the last video, I was showing you how to use the brush tool, just the basic hard round pressure brush in Photoshop with a tablet so that you could really use that pressure sensitivity to go thick to thin. Because I think it makes a difference, unless you're going for a really technical illustration look. And then you can always zoom in with Command plus. You can always clean up the little gaps. This happens in traditional inking too. And so on and so forth. I can always increase my brush size for what's called full bleed areas where I really want to fill it in. Like in the eye sockets. And you can get some interesting effects, right? So I have 50% smoothing on, and it's actually pretty nice. I think this is probably what I would use. It's not slowing my computer down too much. If it's causing your brush to lag a lot, then you want to get rid of it. And I'm using the hand tool here. I can just double click it to get it back to its regular orientation. The hand tool, I can just use the space bar to shortcut to it to move around, but if I want the rotate tool, I have to click on it, and then I can rotate to get certain angles, which can really help with inking, especially when you're trying to do really kind of clean inking like straights. But without that smoothing function that's pretty new in Photoshop, doing these straights would be a real pain. Now, for those of you who love Illustrator, I'm going to show you this, just so it's in the video, but want to use Illustrator tools in Photoshop. That's where the pen tool comes in Photoshop. So, for instance, for straights, I can click with the pen tool there, and then here, and then here, and then here, and then here, then go back and close it, right? And what it gives me is an empty vector path. But then I can right-click on that, and what I can do is I can say, stroke that path, which sounds very dirty. But if I say stroke that path with a pencil, it will give me an even weight based on whatever I have as my pencil setting. Right now my pencil setting is only 1 pixel, so that gave me a 1 pixel outline of it. If I instead, I'm going to go back, and it's going to be a little too heavy, but I'm going to right click and I'm going to say stroke that path. Right click, stroke path with the brush tool. My brush is set at a pretty thick, it's like 60 pixels, right? So then it's like really heavy, but it's drawn in. But if I say stroke that path by right clicking on it, and I say brush but simulate pressure, sometimes this is interesting, and sometimes not. But what it does is it will take the extremes, and it will start at the lowest end, and then go to the highest end. And so if you change your brush settings before that, knowing that, for instance, I can go to my brush that I've been using, and I can set it to, instead of 54, I can set it to, let's see, 22. Then I go to my pen tool, and I right-click on it, and I say stroke path, simulate pressure for brush. That might be something I actually like and use as I keep inking, right? So look at the difference between that kind of inking and this. So sometimes pen tool can be helpful. You can also, of course, use the pen tool for curves to get really perfect curves, even within Photoshop, just like you would in Illustrator. And then you just right-click on it and say, it's a subpath if it's not fully filled in. So stroke subpath. And then you can get this nice kind of brush work within Photoshop. So those are vector tools within Photoshop. The problem is you can't export them as a vector. So there's still always going to be a raster file when you save it. But you can size it to any size within Photoshop before rasterizing it. Yes?
Is the blob shape tool in Illustrator, can you make it a different size, or is it just the same size?
Yes, so if you double click on the blob brush tool in Illustrator, you can change the size just like the pencil tool. And on your computer, because you're updated, you can actually set your blob brush to be pressure sensitive as well. So I'm going to erase that line because that's not super helpful. Just this one. There we go. Okay, and now I'm going to show you what you would do with your Photoshopped inks when you're done. So the first thing is I turn off my sketch. I can leave my white background on. And then I'm going to say, File, Save As, just a JPEG. It doesn't actually matter if you save it as a JPEG or as a PNG, even if you turn the background off, because we're going to use the same settings in Photoshop either way. So I'm just going to treat it like it's a regular JPEG. Very similar to the sketch, right? So now I have my original sketch, which is a PNG but has black and white, it's not transparent. I have the PSD file that I did my digital inking on. And now I have a JPEG of just the clean digital inking. Obviously not finished. Now we're going to use Illustrator. So I'm going to just minimize Photoshop there, open up Illustrator. So Illustrator has this great function. And it's called live tracing or image tracing. And if you open up a raster file, I'm going to start with my sketch to show you why you need to clean it up first. If I open up my sketch in Illustrator, it's a raster file. You know, this is what you would do to sketch over it. But instead of locking it, onion skinning it, and then creating new vector layers on top, what I'm going to do is click on it with the large selection tool. And this is in the newest version of Illustrator, 2022. So it used to be a little different. Once I click on it, on my raster, I go to Properties, which is right next to Layers. In Properties, you're going to see Quick Actions, and you're going to see one called Image Trace. Click on Image Trace, and you're going to choose the only image trace we're ever going to use in this class, because otherwise it gets pretty complicated, black and white logo. So black and white logo is just a bunch of settings which says we're going to find white shapes and black shapes as vectors, and we're going to try to make them clean and distinct like a logo. Okay, so there it does it. That's not great. Parts of it are really cool, but it lost a whole lot of my image, right? So what I do now is I click on this. These are the advanced options for the image trace panel. Now you need to be in the black and white logo preset for these options. And I'll show you why. So you see that there's white shapes and black shapes. This is the artboard here, and that's my image overlapping the artboard. I want them to only be black line art. So the first thing I can do is click on this advanced drop-down for the settings, and I can play with the threshold. If I wanted to capture more of my drawing, I just push it towards more. And this has gotten a lot better than it used to be. Because remember, this is just my pencil sketch. This is what I brought into Illustrator. My screen grab of my pencil sketch. So there's a lot of mess in there. And this setting and algorithm does a pretty good job isolating it. But the most important step, I can also play with the number of paths I want it to have. That will change kind of how smooth it is. I'm customizing it. How many corners I want it to have. How noisy I want it to be. Noise means what's the minimum size. And actually I'm kind of into this really gritty little shards of vectors. But You can play with it. You can see. And even if I allow the threshold to be a lot darker, eventually it's going to get just too dark. So I'm going to lose something. So that's the problem with image tracing. And then I want to say ignore the whites. So that's very important. Click here, otherwise you're going to have a whole lot of white vector shapes you have to delete. So ignore the white. And then when you're happy with it, this is all just previewing. You can still fine-tune it. Let's say I like it right about there. Then over here on the sidebar under properties, you're going to hit expand. If you don't hit expand, even though it looks like a vector, it's not a vector. It's not a vector until you see anchor points on each shape. So when I hit expand, then it changes it to a vector. And you can see all the anchor points, the little blue anchors here that I can independently move around, clean, and change. So that's called live tracing. That went better than I thought it would. I'm pretty shocked with just a pencil sketch. So to really control it, if I'm in a hurry, I might even adapt that, and then I would just use the blob brush tool, the pencil tool, to finish that off. But what if I bring in my clean digital inking? So I'm going to open that with Illustrator that I created in Photoshop. Then the same thing. Here I'm going to move it off to the side so that you can see what I mean by ignore the white. Right? And then I'm in Properties. I'm going to click on Image Trace. I'm going to choose Black and White Logo. And I'm going to open up these options. It's right here. And then I want to open up the advanced options and then click Ignore White. So there's no white shapes. And then I'll actually do Ignore White at the end because it makes it a little bit hard to see. But you see how exact that is. It made almost no change to my digital inking, but now it can be a vector. And I can expand it. And that way I can clean up with vector tools things I wasn't able to clean up otherwise. Like this, I can just use my pencil. All the things we were doing with our logos. And I can set my pencil to be a different smoothness, if I want to clean things up. And then if I want to add to it, my favorite tool, besides the pencil tool in Illustrator, is the blob brush. So I go to the blob brush, I double click on it, I set its default size. I'm going to make it, let's say 50 points. And then I'm going to make it pressure sensitive. If you're on one of the newer computers, you'll have this option. And then I'm going to set it to a variation of the full 50. I'm going to use my stylus. Oh, 50 is way too big. But I have all those options. So let me change it, make it more like 9 point. Okay. And then I can continue the drawing and make kind of a clean vector of it. What's great about the blob brush, to review, especially to those who didn't use it for your logo, is every time you add, it just adds to the existing path that it overlaps. So it means you don't have to merge paths together. You can clean them up using the pencil tool. You can redo them. Making little Nico skeletons. And it's just like inking within Photoshop. If brush sensitivity is, or if tablet sensitivity and pressure sensitivity is working for you, and if you're on one of the new computers, it will. And Maribel, it has traditionally worked on that old computer if you wanted to use the blob brush in Illustrator. But doing it in Photoshop and then bringing it over to Illustrator, you see how well it converts it using Live Trace. So either one works. Now, what's the third option for getting your line art? The third option is like what I was showing you in the FaceTime. It's to do that digital inking. Where is that digital inking? Here it is. is to ink it traditionally, just with a permanent